Hey everyone, welcome to the shop. I'm Brent Shively, Product and Application Trainer for Festool USA. For this project, I'll be building a dining room table. It's a fairly simple design with some unique design features. I'll be using some select tools with plenty of tips and tricks along the way. So I started out with the basic dimensions that I was looking for, about 5 feet in diameter, about 32 inches tall. And then I went into my drawing software and I just started drawing some different designs, different leg shapes, tabletop profiles. I had a couple different designs that I was working with, but this is the one I settled on. So the material for this project kind of chose itself. I had some walnut that was left over from a previous project. I had my local lumber supplier mill this to the proper thickness, and I've cut it to the rough length. So I'll be using that for the legs. The top, I wanted a hard material, but something I hadn't really used before, so I chose ash, which is a very hard and dense material. The tools that I'll be using for this build are some that I haven't used in previous builds, like the TS75. I'll be using that to cut the thicker material. TS60 for cutting the top, OF1400 for doing the edge profile, Domino XL along with the connectors to join the material together, the R150 to sand the top and the legs, the Carvex cordless jigsaw for cutting out the circle, and the Shaper Origin for cutting out somewhat of a template, which we'll talk about later, KS120 for cutting the material to length. I'll also be using the CSC Sys50 cordless table saw, and a couple different dust extractors. And don't forget, like with all the builds I've done, you can access the plans in the link in the description. So I'll be starting with the legs of the table. First thing I need to do is rip a straight edge to reference off of so I can measure and cut them to the proper width. When I place my guide rail, I like to have consistency when I'm ripping down a straight edge on a piece of rough lumber. To do that, I'll use the limit stop that comes with the TS75. I'll use the little lip and I'll reference off the edge of the material. I will push my guide rail up to it. That's going to give me a relatively consistent edge as I rip both sides of this material to then rip it down to the proper width. Anytime I'm using any of our track guided saws, when I put it on a guide rail, I always like to grab the base of the saw and see if there's any play. There's a little bit of play in this one, so then I'll take these screws and I'll slowly tighten them down until I take out all of that slop, but it still slides freely on the guide rail. The leg material was milled to 2 3/4 inches. The TS75 will cut up to 2 7/8. So I'll go ahead and bottom out the depth and cut all the way through. With cutting material this deep, the TS75 puts off a lot of dust and debris. So I've gone ahead and I've switched out to the 36mm hose. That'll give me a little bit more dust extraction. Now that I have a straight edge to reference off of, I can measure for the final width of my leg, which is 4 3/4 inches. The guide rail is, majority of the time, is going to sit on the material that I want to keep. So I measured off of this edge my 4 3/4, so this is the leg that I want to keep. So I want my guide rail sitting here. The problem with that is now that I have not enough support for my guide rail. So what I'm going to do is grab another piece of the material that was milled the same thickness and line it up against here so I have support on the entire guide rail. So with one leg cut, I can complete that same process with the other 3 legs. On the first leg I cut, I have a very nice clean cut that I got with a 36 tooth blade on the TS75. If we flip it over, you can see a lot of teeth marks. To me, that tells me that the guide rail or the material was moving. So I've gone ahead and I've added 2 clamps to the guide rail that'll hold the material and the guide rail in place to give me the same quality cut I had on that first one. So now I have a good reference edge to measure off of. I can measure for my next leg and then the final leg. So now I've got all 4 legs cut. What I'm going to do is let those sit. A lot of times with bigger material, after you cut them out of a bigger piece, they could move. So I'm going to give them a chance to acclimate, move if they're going to move, and I can start working on material for the tabletop. As you can see from the drawing, the tabletop is made up of several different pieces. I choose pieces that were about 7 to 9 inches wide. That's just what my supplier had. It could vary depending on what your supplier has and the type of material you choose. I've gone ahead and I've cut them to approximately the right width to then join them together to create that 60-inch diameter tabletop. Next step will be to clean up both edges so that when they glue up, it's almost seamless. I have the blade that comes on the TS60 in the saw right now, which is the fine blade. Depending on the material you choose to use, you may want to switch to a ripping blade for easier cutting. I've set the depth to just a little over 1.75 inches. I've lowered my dust shroud. I can go ahead and make a cut. If you'd like some more information about the TS60, check out the link in the description. I'll do the same to the other side, and then I can complete all the tabletop boards. The MFT has a sacrificial top. However, I'm cutting a little bit deeper than I'd like to, and I'm in between depth settings. So I can utilize the micro adjust feature, which just simply by turning this dial will change the distance of depth that it's going to cut. Or I can use the 5mm wrench to put in there as well to twist it if I can't reach it with my fingers. Now I have all the tabletop boards completely straight edged. From this stage, I like to just lay everything out, kind of look at the grain patterns, look at how the growth rings are, and I'll alternate those to make sure I get a good strong top. And I'll start to look at everything, make sure everything looks good, and then I'll bring it all together, then I can start to lay out for my dominoes. Next thing I'm going to do is find the center of this material. That way I can pull from that center point and make sure these shorter boards are exactly where I need them to be so I don't have an open corner on one side or the other. Now that I have everything oriented how I'd like it and laid out just the right way, I want to put some reference marks so that when I put it back together, I know exactly how it goes back. I'll be gluing this up in 2 sections. I'll have a left side and a right side. Once those 2 sides are all dry, I can then join them together with 2 domino connectors with some solid wood tenons. So I'll go ahead and lay those out as well as some solid wood tenons for the rest of the pieces. I don't need them for strength, they're simply for alignment because some of these boards have a bow in them. As I mark these out, I'll also label them whether a tight or a loose mortise and also whether they're a wood tenon or a domino connector. So I've marked the tabletop for position, I've numbered all the boards, and I've also marked the position for my dominoes. Next step in the process is to get out the Domino 700 and make some mortises. The tenons I'll be using are 14 by 100. So I have the 14mm cutter in here. I can set my mortise depth to 50 and change my fence height to 20, materials about 40mm. And then I will switch the mortise width to the loose setting. With everything set, I can go ahead and start making some mortises. Something you always want to remember when you're using the Domino 700, because it's cutting so deep and such a large cutter, we don't get all the dust out. So I always like to try and make sure I dump the dust out as I'm cutting those mortises. We've got most of the domino mortises cut. We have to cut one more for our connector. On the connector, we've got the expansion anchor, we have the connector bolt, and then we have the cross anchor. The way this goes in, the expansion anchor will go into one mortise that we've already created. The expansion bolt will screw into that. But now we have to cut the mortise for the cross anchor bolt. And that's going to be cut from the bottom of the other piece, mortising straight down into the piece. When I laid out all my mortises, everything was done from the top of my table. I know these other mortises I need to make are going to be from the back side, so I need to transfer my marks from the front to the back. Because I'm going to be plunging vertically, I want to put on the support base. I know that this mortise needs to be 40mm back from the edge of my material. So what I'll do is I'll put my fence down and adjust my fence height to 40 millimeters, lock that down. Now when I hold it in the vertical position, I know I'm cutting my mortise exactly 40 millimeters at the center from the edge of my material. All connector mortises are tight, and set the mortise depth to 30 millimeters. With all the mortises cut, we can go ahead and do a dry fit. Everything went together nicely. I'm gonna wait to put the connectors in until I have the two halves glued up and I bring those back together. So go ahead and take everything apart, put each half in glue up, and then we can start working on the legs. One thing I like to do is I'll put a piece of painter's tape on the clamp bar itself. That way, if any glue seeps out, it doesn't get stuck on my bar clamp and I don't have to spend time cleaning it up. Both halves of the tabletops are completely set. I've pulled them out of the clamps, scraped off any residual glue. Now I can glue both the halves together with the domino connectors. So I've got the glue on there, the domino connectors locked down. I threw 2 extra clamps on there just to lock it all together. I'll let it sit for a good while. We can go ahead and start working on the base. Next step in the process is we're going to cut the legs to length at the right angle and also put a chamfer on all 4 edges. I'll be using the Capex to cut these angles and cutting it to length. So the first thing I'll do is set it to 16 degrees, and I know I need them 31 3/16 from long point to short point. So I'll go ahead and set my scale to 31 3/16. I can go ahead and cut one angle, slide it down, cut the other angle, and that'll be my finished length. If you'd like to learn more about the Capex, check out the link in the description. Now that I have the legs cut to length, the next step is to put a chamfer on all 4 edges of each leg. I'd like having that look of the chamfer so it's not a sharp, crisp edge. I know I want to take off about 3/8 of an inch down from the front edge with that chamfer bit. So I've got a 3/8 inch spacer. All I'll do for right now is just eyeball it. And once that's on there, lock that in place. I can set my depth stop if I need to do any micro adjusting. Because I'll be creating some larger chips, I've gone ahead and switched out to the 36 millimeter hose to help alleviate any clogging in the dust port. If you want to learn more about the OL 1400, check out the link in the description. I'm happy with that depth setting, so now I can route the edges on all 4 legs. Sometimes when using a profile bit, it's hard to figure out exactly where to start without having to look underneath the router to see where that bit is. On all of our routers, we have a center line marked for that bit. So if I hold the handle in line with my angle, I can see where that center line is, and I know right where the edge of that material is. I can get a good clean start. So it may seem like there's a lot of dust left over, but for anybody that's used a router, you know that's not very much. But just to show you, I'm gonna go ahead and take the hose off, and I'll take the chip catcher off, and we'll see how much dust is left. So as you can see, without the chip catcher and the dust extraction in 32 inches, it creates an enormous amount of dust. If I was doing this all day long, every day, there'd be a lot of dust. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it back on and we'll get everything cleaned up. So with the legs complete, I can start working on the other components for the base of the table. First thing I'm gonna do with the CSC is rip these pieces down to 1 7/8 for the cross members. If you'd like to learn more about the CSC 50, check out the link in the description. First, I'll set the fence to 2 7/8 inches. Then I'll set my blade depth to the preset of 1 7/8. And now I can rip my 2 cross members. So while I have the CSC out, I'll go ahead and rip these boards to their final width. These are gonna be the base top frame. And these will be 4 1/4 inches wide. With everything ripped to the proper width, I can go over to the Capex and start cutting things the proper length. I'm gonna work on the main cross member first. I know that's gonna be 33 3/16 long to the long point of those angles. It's gonna be the same 16-degree angle I cut my table legs at. To calculate the length of the 2 shorter pieces, I'll find the center of my main piece I've already cut. Then I'll measure off there half the thickness of my main cross member, and that'll give me the exact length of the 2 pieces that I need. With that drawn out, that gives me 2 points to measure to for my 2 smaller pieces. While I'm still working at the Capex, I'll go ahead and cut the top base frame members to the proper length. And these will be the frame at the top, where will be the connection point between the legs and the tabletop. With all the work at the Capex done, I can jump back to the cross members and lay out for the mortises and break out the domino. Layout for this is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to use 2 tenons in the middle, one at the top and one at the bottom of this board, going all the way through and connecting to each one of these separate pieces. To make sure I stay centered on all my mortises, whether it's going to be in the angle or the straight pieces, I'm going to attach the trim stop to the fence of the domino. I've found that it's easier to set up when I take the fence off, and I've got a scrap board here with my centered mark. I'll be using a 14 by 100 tenon, so I have the 14mm cutter in here. I'll have my fence height set to 15 on the first mortise, and then I'll switch it to 40. My plunge depth will be at 50mm, and I'll have this as a tight mortise. Other than the fence height, all the settings will stay the same on these mortises. So I'll go ahead and take this off for the through mortise. Dry fit looks good. Now we can move to glue up. So I've set up some clamps and how I wanted to lock it together. Last thing I'm going to do is put some blue tape down on the MFT to prevent any glue squeeze out from sticking to the wood and the MFT itself. Now that I've got everything square, I need a little bit of clamping pressure here in the center, so I'll put some of my offcuts here and here to apply clamping pressure to make this nice and tight. With this all set up in glue, I'm going to push it aside, let it dry. I'll bring in another MFT so I can start working on the legs. First thing I'm going to do before I do any layout is decide which is the top and which is the bottom of the legs. It'll be your own personal preference. Now that I know where the top is, I've gone ahead and I've laid out the bottom of my cross members, which is 24¼ from the top. The way I determine that distance is I want to make sure people could put their feet underneath that cross member if they wanted to. You could really put it wherever you'd like. I've also made a mark at 22 5/8 from the top down, which is the center of my mortise. Now I can go ahead and lay out the center of my leg. I'll stack them all together and make sure they're all laid out exactly the same. Figuring the layout for this leg took me a little bit of time, so I cut some scrap lumber that mimics the cross members themselves, and I drew exactly where I want the mortise to go. I'm going to have the mortise going at an angle on the cross member, and it's going to be perpendicular to the leg. So when I hold this up here, you can see exactly how the mortise is going to go in. I've laid out exactly where I want my mortise to go. Now I need to find some reference points on the domino machine itself. If we look at the side, we have a line that marks the dead center of the mortise. From there to the back plate of the domino is 15 millimeters. So now I can use this as my reference just as long as I mark a line 15 millimeters from the center of my mortise back. So now as you can see, here's the center of my mortise, and this is the line that I marked 15 millimeters back. If I line the base of the domino up, and then the center mark right here for where the cutter is, when I plunge down, I know that mortise will be dead center. Last thing I need to change is the mortise depth, which will be 70. I've left it on the tight setting. Now I can make my mortise. Now I'll lay out the rest of these with my 15 millimeter mark, and I can do the rest of the mortises. I'd still like the cross members to sit a little bit more in clamps, so I'm going to go ahead and just sand all the surfaces of the legs. And also round over the bottom edges with the sander just to keep that from chipping when the legs are in their final place. While I have the legs sitting here, I'm going to use a hard hand sanding block to clean up these chamfers just a little bit from any of the router marks left behind. And then I can jump over to the cross member. I know if I look at my example piece here, I need to come down from this top edge 30 millimeters to the center of my mortise. And I know that I'm going to be going into this board at an angle, which is 74 degrees on the domino fence. That is also the 90 degrees minus 16, which I cut this angle at. So what I typically do, will take the fence off the domino, and I will match my angle exactly to what it's cut. Even though I know it should read 74 degrees, I can lock that on here, and then I can adjust the height of my fence to 30. And now I'm ready to make my mortises. And I know I need to be dead center of this material, so I can utilize the trim stop, which I had pre-adjusted from the time before. My depth's already set. I'm going to stay on the tight setting. Now I can make my mortise. If you haven't already, make sure you get the rest of the dust and debris out of the mortise. With those mortises cut, we can do a dry fit of the base assembly. Dry fit turned out good. I'll go ahead and pull it apart, do a little bit of sanding and some router work on the cross members. First thing I'm going to do is do the same grip progression I did with the legs. But before I add my abrasive, I want to go ahead and vacuum off the pad to make sure there's no debris stuck on the pad before I put the abrasive. Now that I've got the sanding complete, I've gone ahead and installed a 1/4 inch roundover bit in the 1400 router. So I'll do the top and bottom edges. I've gone ahead and I've removed the chip catcher because that will inhibit me from getting into the corners. So with everything routed, everything sanded, I can go to final glue up of the base. I've got everything in clamps. I've cleaned up all the glue. We'll let this set up, and now I can start working on the base top frame. The purpose of the base top frame is twofold. One is to stiffen up the base, and two, it's the attachment point from the base to the tabletop. It'll allow for expansion contraction, which I'll touch on when we attach the top to the base. I let the base set up in clamps for a couple hours. I've gone ahead and pulled the clamps off, sanded off any of the residual glue. Now I can go ahead and lay the center of the posts for where the mitered frame is going to be attached. To attach the base top frame pieces, I'll just be using a little bit of glue, pre-drill, and then some screws. Happy how this turned out. I'll go ahead and wipe off any excess glue. Then we'll move on to cutting the circle in the tabletop. So I went ahead and I pulled this out of clamps and then just did a little bit of sanding on the front and back from 40 grit up to 100 grit. You can see how nice and flat it is by using the dominoes to make everything aligned. So now I'll go ahead and lay out the center of the entire board. Then I can put the shaper tape down so the shaper has something to reference off of. If you have any questions about the shaper origin, check out the link in the description. If you're familiar with the origin, the first step in the process is to scan the whole tabletop so I can map out the material surface. With the whole surface mapped out, I can actually design the circle on the origin itself. Now I just need to line the center point of the circle on screen to the center point of the material that I marked out earlier, and that will integrate the circle into the map surface. I've got everything programmed into the shaper origin, and I'll be making 2 passes, so I'll get the first one started. Pass 1 complete, I'll clean up the groove a little bit, and then I'll do pass 2. The second pass complete, I can vacuum that out. I can now come back with the Carvex and I'll cut on the outside of that line freehand. Then I'll come back with the 1400 router and clean it all up. So with the rough cut complete, I'll go ahead and clean up a little bit, then I'll set up the 1400 router to clean up this edge. I've installed a top bearing compression bit in the 1400 router. Compression bit is an upcut and a downcut spiral bit all in one. It gives me a nice clean cut, and I'll end up having to do 2 passes just because of the total height of this bit. The first pass turned out really good. So rather than having to flip the whole entire top over to trim up that last little bit, I'm going to go ahead and lower the bit from this side. To do so, I'll have to remove the chip catcher. So as you can see, the chip catcher does provide great dust extraction when attached to the 1400 router. Now I'll go ahead and put the router away. I'll clean up a little bit, and then I'll break out the sander, and I'll start cleaning up this edge a little bit, make sure there's no ripples left behind from the router bit. So I'm going to start out with 60 grit with the Rotex, and I'll go through the grit progression up to 100 grit, and then we can route the profile on the top and bottom edges. I've gone ahead and installed a 1/2 inch roundover bit that I'll use for both the top and bottom edge of the tabletop. Because this bit isn't a compression bit, I'm going to take my time as I go around the table because I'll be changing grain directions to help avoid any tear out. I've gone ahead and flipped it over, now I can do the bottom side. With both the top and bottom sides rounded over with the bottom side facing up, I can move right into attaching the base to the tabletop. I'll draw one line across the widest point of the circle. I'll find the center of that line, square off of that, and that'll give me 4 points to line up the 4 corners of the base of my tabletop. So with it on and lined up with these points, I'll go around and I'll measure from the edge to each long point to get it perfectly centered. Now that I have the base centered on the top, I'll go ahead and pre-drill for 4 screws that'll attach the base to the top. Luckily my top's thick enough I don't have to be too concerned, but make sure you don't drill too deep to where you drill through the top of your table. When building furniture, especially tabletops, you always want to think about expansion, contraction through the different seasons. In this case, I'm going to add a mortise where my screw hole is, add a washer, then put it back together, and that'll allow for the tabletop to expand and contract and still have the base attached securely. I want to lay out for the mortise that I'm going to be doing with the Domino 700. I want that mortise to be perpendicular to the grain of the tabletop. So I'll draw it on the walnut, give myself some center points to make that mortise. I've installed the 8mm cutter. I'll be plunging about 20mm. I'm going to install the support base for plunging vertically. It has a center line that'll line up with the marks that I made previously. I've gone ahead and set it to the wide setting and go ahead and make my mortise. Before we make the final attachment, I'm going to do some final sanding with 120 grit to the base and the bottom of the top. With the sanding complete, I can join the top to the base. So first I'll roll the top out of the way, I'll bring the base over here, then I'll get some help lowering the top onto the base. With the base secured to the top, I can finish sand this to 120 grit. The construction of the table is now complete. Now I can start thinking about finishes. What I'm going to go with is probably an oil on the base and a clear finish on the top. But what you choose for your table is completely up to you. Thanks for joining me on this build series. I had a really great time building this table. I hope you learned a few things along the way, and I'll see you on the next build series. Don't forget to subscribe.